Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CSFL Kickoff Show podcast. And well, it is that time of year where we bring one of our special guests in, really, who does quite a considerable amount of work on the CSFL during the off season and during the pre-season. And that is none other than Zach, the former Green Bay Packers GM, but now the New Orleans Saints GM. And also, I believe you've made GM of the Year, Zach. Am I right in saying that this year?
Yeah, I actually forgot about that, but I
There
guess
you go.
so.
And
Yeah.
GM of the Year. Obviously, Jack, you produce these amazing articles and sort of previews for every single team, ranking them, from top to bottom. And you completed that yesterday. And well, today we're going to sort of dive into a little bit more of the detail, pick Zach's brain a little bit and sort of his thinking. And well, of course, because of that, Zach, being a fantastic person who provides some amazing insights and articles for the league, you have gone well above and beyond and produced a tier list for this season's preview. And I'm going to put that up on the screen right now. And I'd be really interested, Zach, perhaps if we start there and just talk us through the tiers you've got, and then we'll dive in and talk about some teams and some movers and shakers this year.
Yeah, I'm excited to, kind of go over this and hopefully I can kind of explain myself if anyone has questions. And as far as the tier list, I put this together yesterday when it kind of groups the teams according to how I feel about them. A lot of these teams, one team might be ranked 12th, another team might be ranked 15th, but in all honesty, it's almost a tie. Um, Kind of start at the top. I think the Lions are the favorite. They won the championship last year. Really, no explanation needed there, but I think there's enough of a gap, talent-wise, GM-wise, than from some of the other teams. They really kind of deserve their own tier in my mind. The next one, Super Bowl contenders. These are just teams that I think are the strongest chance to knock off the Lions this year and get a title. And then that third tier, these are teams I fully expect to be in the playoffs, but once they get there, they might be a little bit outmatched for different reasons that we can kind of get into later. And then the next tier, these are kind of my barely in, barely out teams. So teams that I expect to compete for a playoff spot, but obviously they can't all make it. So these are teams that a lot of wild card teams that are going to be barely out of the playoffs, that type of thing. And the last tier, or not the last tier, I'm sorry, the second to last tier, these are teams that are kind of similar to the bottom tier, but they have a little higher upside. I think more than likely a lot of these teams in the second to last tier are going to be below average, but they have enough upside that they could make the playoffs. And then the bottom tier, a lot of these teams rank bottom 10 in both offense and defensive talent, so I think their upside is more limited.
Great. I mean, thank you very much for putting together this tier list. It's really interesting, and the previews have been fantastic. So, if anyone hasn't managed to go through those, grab on the article section of the Discord server and have a flick up, because there are literally so many great previews for your own team or for other teams. It's just fantastic. So, I think before we start talking about maybe some of the observations that we've got in terms of the tier listing and some of the breakdowns you provided on the server, I'd just be interested to understand from the start, really, did the transition from Draft Day Sports 21 to the new version 22 play any factor into this, or is it sort of existing methodologies that you're kind of porting over? Interested to get your thoughts into maybe if that's made an impact, or if that's something you considered for this year's.
No, I mean, as far as the rankings themselves, they really have no the switch to 22 really had no impact, and the only reason I say that is I haven't really tested 22 much at all. As far as what positions may matter more or less, that type of thing, I don't really have that knowledge right now, so it really had no impact whatsoever. Obviously, with that being said, anytime you switch to a new game like this, it's going to have some impact, and so I think there's a lot of reason for shake-up in these rankings. I think this next game could impact teams, could help teams, some teams more or less than I'm able to predict, but it should be interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be interesting. It's a bit of a learning curve for everyone in the first season. Whenever we we port over to the latest version of the game. So we'll see how that plays out. But coming back to the tier list that you've got here, I guess by immediate observation, without diving into each tier and talking about teams, is that there's a real middle to bottom pack of teams in the league at the moment from your assessment, in that there's quite a large proportion that will be competing for a playoff spot, and then there's quite a big proportion of the teams that are kind of sitting below that. And interesting in terms of the weighting, it's very obviously it gets narrower as it goes to the top. But I was interested in terms of those three tiers. Was it difficult to kind of pull those together, or was it a case of the teams above are just that little bit of a step ahead at this stage?
Yeah, so kind of to start, I can kind of give a high level of how I do the rankings themselves, and I know a lot of people probably already know this, as I've mentioned it in the chat and whatnot, but it's really kind of two parts. So the first part is pure roster talent, and that kind of starts with me looking at every single player and sort of adjust what I would call adjusting their overall rating. So if they're given an overall rating of, let's say, 82, but they're really low in speed, I may bump that down in kind of my own adjustments to maybe 79 overall or and whatnot. If I have a player I really like, but maybe he just doesn't quite have the position skill yet, but I think it won't really impact him much, I'll give him a little bit of bump in overall. And then once I make all those adjustments to the players themselves, then that's how I kind of rank the roster. It's all formula based, and I weight different positions differently, kind of based on my own preference there. But the roster rankings, I would say, is probably half the total score I give a team. The other half is based on GM history and whether that GM has a history of success or not, that type of thing. And when you kind of get into the rankings, the tiers, you can kind of tell that I think there's a top tier of GMs that have really proven themselves in prior seasons, and we'll kind of get into that. And then I think there's a cluster of teams that have talent here and there on their roster, but maybe quite haven't proven that as far as their GM going out and kind of showing the league what they can do.
Yeah, so interesting observation and great insight into how you calculate the ratings and the rankings, and for anyone who's new watching, that's fantastic to understand. So let's dive in at the bottom then, in terms of the bottoms here you've got here. I guess I'm really interested to understand any teams that you found of interest in here, any big changes possibly from maybe how before you produced the rankings to how they ended up. If there's any sort of key ones to pull out here, I mean, I get a sense there's quite a few new GMs, quite a few actual veteran GMs, maybe the roster talent side not quite there. But are there any sort of key teams that you want to sort of highlight in this bottom tier?
Yeah, there's a few I can go over. I know the Vikings, they dropped a lot. They had 7 wins last year, so it's maybe a little bit of a shock to see them this low and go over them. 49ers, I know had some, when I posted them as low as I did, and with the Roethlisberger acquisition, I know that caught some eyes there, so we can kind of go over that. The most of these teams, though, on the bottom tier, as I noted, they're if you look at their roster talent, almost all these teams are bottom 12 in both offense and defense roster rankings. I think the only exception is the Buccaneers have the 15th best offense and offensive rankings. Most of these teams have 6 or less wins last year, as noted, with the exception of the Vikings. So it's just hard to see reason for upside with these teams. But as noted, there's some new GMs here, and that's almost impossible to predict. So if you get the right GM, even with the below average roster, we have history in this league what that can mean. So I'm definitely room for surprises with that.
Yeah, let's dive into two of the teams that you mentioned. Then you picked out there. I guess the Minnesota Vikings, as you said. Let's start with them. So they won 7 games last year. Obviously had a GM transition, I think, during the off season. But the previous GM had kind of built them into this position to try and win now. Is it a case of roster talent has changed drastically, or did GM change just kind of put a bit of an unknown spanner in the works? Give us a breakdown, a little bit more detail as to maybe why the Vikings have dropped off so much from where they finished last year.
Yeah, so this was just the last GM kind of sold his future for kind of a win now approach. Um, sorry, what that meant was the new GM came in with a bad cap situation and no picks, which is about as bad a situation you can come into. They did have some roster talent, as noted with the win now approach, but a lot of that they lost Frank Gore, I think, to retirement. Des Bryant was kind of a casualty. So that was their two big losses on offense, and then they lost defensive tackle McCoy. I'm not really too sure if he was just a free agent or not, and another defensive tackle in can't pronounce his name, but so they lost four key players and really didn't add anybody. I think it's gonna be more of a reset year for the Vikings, and so yeah, their ranking. They won 7 games, but there was a lot of talent lost there.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at the Vikings, my personal observation is that they've lost a bit of talent, as you mentioned there. They still have a fair bit to kind of give every team they play a game this season. I don't think they're necessarily going to be a playoff team, but I think they'll be very competitive. So I was interested in the sense that they are in that bottom tier on your observation. I mean, I would place them probably in that below average tier. I mean, they've still got a good offensive line. On defense, I think they've still got enough pieces there. Granted, if they lose a back of some sort, they will have issues because they have a bit of a depth issue there. For me, I think the gap is particularly in the receiver core, the tight end core. Not a lot of options there really for them to play with. So I still think they'll be competitive. They'll be good on good to average on both sides of the ball is what I would say for the Vikings. But let's talk a little bit then about the 49ers. So you said obviously that shook some eyes and some heads in the league when they were pitched so low. They obviously acquired Roethlisberger in the offseason, a big free agency move for them. Give us your take on the 49ers and why they are still down the bottom, despite acquiring probably one of the league's best quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, what it really comes down to is, I mean, yeah, I know Dylan probably has the capability to be a great GM. I don't know, but just based on history, they won 5 games last year. That I don't think they were really that good the last few years. So just basing on production, there's just not that much there to get me up, get me hyped up that they're going to be better this year. So that's one factor. Second, more than anything, this defense is just. I mean, they ranked 31st in defensive talent. So I really no need to break that down too much, but I just don't think this is a good defense. And the Roethlisberger, the acquisition there caught a lot of eyes, but I still don't think overall this is top 15 offensive roster. Even with drafting Cooper, I think he'll be a great asset for the future, but he's their best wide receiver, and they only have 3 wide receivers on the roster, and I'm really not that high on the other 2 that much. So this is a below average offensive line. I think it's still, even with Cooper, I think it's one of the worst receiver groups in the league. And then they do still have, I think, 9 or 10 million in cap. So if there's a couple big cuts here, they still have plenty of room to maybe make some late improvements, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting, the 49ers, how they do this year. They are in surprisingly competitive division now, actually, I have to say. In that, we'll probably talk about the Cowboys and the Giants later and their ding-dong battle they had last season. But I think, for me, offensive line, if they can get some additional talent in there and maybe add something in terms of the defensive side. They've got a lot of depth on the defensive side, but not necessarily the talent, is what I would say. In some key areas. So I mean, I would probably, on the face of it now, if they don't manage to bring in any offensive line talent, is probably the big concern that I have with them. I would have them between, in my opinion, between the bottom tier and the average playoff sort of tier is where I'd have them at the moment. But yeah, we'll see what Dylan can come up with in terms of the team and the rotation and things, because there is certainly some talent on that 49ers team now. So that kind of covers the 2 that we wanted to have a little look at in the bottom tier. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that tier from any of the other teams? I mean, we've got some new GMs in there. I'm guessing that's factored a little bit into the decision for some of these teams as well.
Yeah, I didn't really note it earlier, but I forgot to note the Bills. Obviously, ranked 25th now, 13 wins last year. It really just comes down to I thought Toasty got the most out of this talent. And now with the new GM, I just, for all I know, this new GM could be great. I don't know, but obviously, when I'm doing the rankings, they get hit with the new GM penalty combined with, I think, average at best roster talent. Um, so it was hard for me to rank them higher, but if the new GM proves to be good, obviously, they have a much higher ceiling than they're ranked.
Yeah, and I think that's fair to say for any of the new GMs who are listening back on this, that is a fair, sizable chunk of the consideration that goes into your rankings. So I would say if you are ranked lower than probably you project, it's probably because you're just that little bit of an unknown package, and until I guess we kind of see that materialize, it's a bit of a difficult one to factor into the equation in terms of if you've been successful in other multiplayer leagues, for example. Um, Unless you're Skelter and you come along and everyone knows you've won goodness knows how many championships, then that gets factored in. But there we go. So let's move on to the below talent sort of average playoff upside. I mean, a really interesting mixed bag of teams here. Teams who have had some interesting draft picks, some teams who performed very well last season. I mean, for me, when I looked at this, I was like, there's no consistent factor across this set of teams in this tier. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts into if there's a couple of interesting ones that you want to sort of try and break down a little bit more detail on the show today.
Yeah, to be honest, I think they're all kind of interesting in their own right. Like you said, they all kind of got ranked here for different reasons. I think, as noted, these teams have more upside than the bottom tier, but they also have, a pretty limiting factor that has them ranked lower. You can start with the Colts. 6 wins last year. I think a new GM. I don't know. Maybe he came in late last year. I'm not too sure, but they have a top 10 roster talent. So that's kind of the trend. Seahawks kind of the same thing. New GM. So a little bit penalized there. They're kind of the opposite. They have a very strong defense, but probably a bottom 10 offense. So there's kind of the trend here. There's reason for optimism, but pretty major question marks on these teams as well.
Yeah, I mean, can I give a couple of teams that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on? I guess the first one would be the Chargers, who had obviously a high draft pick in terms of they managed to take Jared Goff, who you I think referenced in your previous, probably going to eventually be a top five quarterback in this league, and I'm guessing that's one of the big factors that has kind of spurred this team probably from being a bottom side team last year to making that step change. Are there any other factors in that Chargers team that's got you excited about this season other than Jared Goff, who I would fully expect to be unbelievable over the next several years or so?
No, this was basically a golf improvement here. This surprisingly, I didn't realize this last year. I guess they're kind of under the radar with their 5 wins, but this was actually a pretty good defense last year. Their roster talent is top 20 in defense. They were 14th in yards allowed, 16th in points allowed. So this is not a bad defense at all. I don't know why I kind of thought they were. Just kind of running off memory last year, but the real weakness of this team last year was 26 in points. So I think I don't think they were very good at quarterback last year. So if Goff is the answer they're looking for, honestly 21 might be a little bit low. I think just from an upside standpoint, this is a playoff, borderline playoff roster.
Yeah, I mean, they did Josh Norman, I think, over the offseason as well in terms of defensive talent, which is a huge upgrade for them in the back situation. I mean, for me, I look at this Chargers team and I'm just really excited because I consider them very similar actually who next to them on the tier here to the Oakland Raiders a couple of years ago, where they obviously brought in Manning, but obviously Chargers have got Goff, and they brought in some wide receiver talent. But the Chargers have Garcon, Green, and Weber in terms of a trio of receiving talent, which is unbelievable, to be perfectly honest with you. So I'm really excited to see what they can do on the offensive side this year. And depending on how that offensive line pans out, which is, again, an offensive line at this moment in time that's probably deep but not necessarily talented, If they can hold that together well enough, that could be a top 10 offense quite easily. So for me, Chargers I'm going to be watching just because I want to see how Goff does with that receiving core, providing he gets a bit of time in the pocket, really.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think they're going to be a fun team to watch, and a couple other teams I think are interesting. Or I think we have to talk about the Bengals with their late trade, and then Chiefs also might be a little bit surprised. 10 wins last year. They're kind of the story of kind of the surprise last year with their early success, getting 10 wins. So seeing them this low, seeing this team this low might be a little bit of a surprise to some as well.
So what made you? Let's start with the Chiefs. What made you sort of factor in from 10 wins last season to probably not making the playoffs this year? Was it purely schedule? Because I assume the the GM factor is probably in favour of the Chiefs now. They demonstrated that they could perform well in a tough division. Really, what was the factor that made you drop them down this season?
I think they had kind of a rough offseason. I don't know if it'll hurt them too much kind of long term. I think they kind of more youth. But when you're looking at this season, they lost free safety Carr, which is like 95 overall. They lost Flowers, another safety 94 overall. They lost Antonio Brown, 89 overall. Walker 86 overall. And they didn't really have any big additions. Again, they have some young additions I think will help long term, but their only really big addition kind of right now is that cornerback from the Steelers who isn't very fast. So I think when you look at their defensive talent, I had them graded out as 30th, and I think they'll be fine offensively. I just worry about that defense. That's kind of I think when they finished last year, they were close to 13 or 14th in the power rankings or thereabouts. So these defensive losses, and Antonio Brown dropped them about 5 spots.
Okay, and then I guess moving on to talk quickly about the Bengals. We mentioned the trade in terms of bringing in Robert Griffin III. Has that changed your thinking on the ceiling for the Bengals this season?
Yeah, I think I would change. I don't know if I would. It completely changes the picture. I think, one move isn't gonna completely change everything, but I think I would move them closer to kind of where the Eagles and Browns are. Kind of, I'd probably move them up 3 or 4 spots for sure. When you look at their season last year, I think they ranked almost last, and they were not only last, but they were kind of an outlier. Pretty big gap in some of the QB stats. They were pretty dreadful last year in QB stats, so that's kind of a downside. But on the plus side, if they can just be average, there's so much room for improvement there that they can just be average. They'll be so much better as an offense. I think they're 30th in points, but like I said, their quarterback play was so bad that if RG3 doesn't need to be good, he doesn't need to be great. He just, if he can just be average, this team will be competing for a playoff spot.
And I guess stepping a little bit back from the tiers and just from your GM experience, do you think the time has passed for RG3 to probably be that, even if I just say top 15 quarterback in this league, or do you feel there's still room for him to possibly be moulded into that given the ratings that he has and the ability to also run on the ground as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I don't think he's going to be a top 15 quarterback. I just don't think he's there. But a big part of the equation is the new engine. How do running quarterbacks do in the new engine? That type of thing. That could be if it's like 19, I'm sorry, not 19, 21, where quarterback running is hard to come by. If you look at his his arm stats, his arm ratings are maybe a little bit below average at best. So I don't think he's ever going to be a top 15 passer, but if he can get running in the new engine, that could kind of propel him to a higher rating.
Yeah, well, I'll be interested to see how he does because obviously, I mean, Kyrus on the servers obviously mentioned it several times, but and I think he came in, he was very similar in terms of Cam Newton in terms of a ratings ability. unfortunately he had those training drop-offs with GM changes, etc. That's meant he's never got to that ceiling that probably he could have got to. But it'd be an interest to see how his career pans out now. Maybe he's found the right type of home and GM in the Bengals who'll probably give him a fair shot and probably give him the right type of strategy around him to hopefully make him thrive. So I'm really excited to see how that goes. So let's move on to the sort of middle pack of teams here that you've got. So these are teams that you've listed down as probably going to be competing for a playoff spot. Again, I mean, a real mixed bag of teams here, from teams who you could arguably say have underperformed historically, teams that have massively, jumped up and down. So they'd have one season where they probably performed very well, one season they performed terribly, and sort of yo-yoing between this spot. But let's hear your thoughts in terms of which ones were of most interest to you when you were kind of writing out that got you excited about them as a team probably making the playoffs this year.
So when I was looking at it, the Browns kind of surprised me. I say that in terms of their roster talent. I think they have a solid GM that's on its way up, and I kind of thought they were probably a bottom 10 roster, but with the addition of Bosa, some of the other additions they made, I think this is a top 15 roster. I mean, just barely. I'm not going to say they're top 10 yet, but it's a really competitive roster. So I like where this team is going. Jets are another team that I think some people might be surprised by. I could be completely wrong. We'll see. Obviously, I've talked to the Jets GM a lot, and I think he really knows what he's doing. So I'm kind of betting on him there. That's kind of a GM bet. We'll see if it pays off. I think he knows what to do with that team. It's an elite secondary. I think he'll find a way to get enough out of the offense. Same with the Steelers. I'm not really going to break down that roster too much. We kind of know it's very limited offensively, but I was never a big fan of the Steelers rosters, or I'm sorry, the Bills rosters back when Toasty, the GM. I think they've always kind of been bottom 15 roster in my eyes. Maybe that's not fair. I mean, I could be wrong, but just when I judged it, that's kind of how I saw it. But I think he always got the most out of it, so that's kind of why I have the Steelers so high. I think the Steelers are a top 10 defense on paper, and I think he'll figure out something for the offense to make them top 15. And then some of the other teams, not to be harsh, but Patriots, Dolphins, and Packers, I think all kind of are in the same boat where they're, still top 10 rosters, but haven't really proven with the current GMs that they can kind of take that step with that roster talent. So obviously their ceiling is so high if they can take that next step, but that's kind of why they fell.
Yeah, and I guess the two you haven't mentioned there, the Jags and the Texans. I guess best I've described them as new kids on the block. In terms of the GMs are fairly sort of new in terms of building their team, but Jags obviously had a transitionary sort of off season, moving the quarterback around, bringing in some talent. Texans probably established themselves last year as being in this pack now and firmly in this pack. And then obviously you talked about the Bears, I think, previously, in terms of probably got some of the talent now to make this up. It's just a case of whether it kind of mixes together. So I guess in terms of the teams you've got here, are there any way you would stick your neck on the line and say, yeah, they are probably going to be it a wild card slot or a playoff slot at this stage, versus maybe some who are going to be neck and neck within their division or within their conference for maybe those final spots?
Yeah, I mean, as kind of the theme with my rankings, I think roster talent, especially kind of when you get in this middle tier, it's kind of not as important. I think all the teams sort of have strengths and weaknesses, so I think more than anything, it comes down to as a GM, as a game plan, as a playbook, can you get the most out of it? If I had to bet, I'm gonna probably put my money on the Jets and Steelers to get a wild card spot. Maybe the Jets can even top the Patriots. And then, I think I'm pretty high on the Bears. I think I love the Bears roster. I love what he's doing there. I just, they may be in a tough position. I say that as I think last year, all the playoff teams in the NFC had 12 wins. So he could be in a tough spot where he gets 10, 11 wins, and it could be the same situation this year where the NFC South and NFC East wildcard teams are, again at 11 or 12 wins. And then, of course, they got the Lions. You guys probably going to win 13 plus. So I'm really high on the Bears, but they may be in a really tough spot as far as what they need to get in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think the Bears are a team that I think I said last year are maybe one or two pieces away from going from being this wild card slot team to being in that probably the next tier of being one of a great team, but maybe see how it goes in the playoffs because they're a bit of an unknown. I still think they're one or two pieces away. I think unfortunately cap constraints, challenges of kind of still limiting them at that point. So maybe they can find that move or find that extra piece of talent or strategy in 22 that can hopefully excel them a little bit more up this tier list that you've got here. But I think what's really interesting about this tier in particular is it highlights how crazy competitive the American East is going to be this year. In that you've got the Patriots, the Dolphins, and the Jets all sort of sitting in this tier. So to me, that sort of screams that there's no real team that's probably going to take that division comfortably. I guess interested to get your thoughts in terms of is that kind of what you thought from sort of reflecting on the tiers here and on the rankings, or whether one of them is sort of sticking out slightly above the other two.
Yeah, the American East has kind of been a thorn in my side ever since I started doing these predictions. I just can't get a feel for what's going to happen there. It's kind of the same story this year. I don't. The Patriots, has been the story for a while now. They have a top 10 roster. The Dolphins, I love their roster. But, it just hasn't, it's hard to predict what that will result in. I think the Dolphins have made some runs in recent years. I know they had I think it was a couple of seasons ago where they, I think were set for a playoff spot and then lost their last 4 games. The Patriots have shown kind of glimpses here and there of they've had good runs kind of for half a season or whatnot, and then their quarterback gets injured. So it's just really been both of these teams I think have talent. Even as a GM, they've shown the ability to put together strong runs, but they just haven't really done it for 16 games. So if they can do that, I think whatever team does it will pass the Jets. But if they kind of falter a little bit again, I think the Jets will be in position to take that division.
I think it's going to be one of the most interesting divisions to watch. I think just in terms of, I think that they're going to be very, very much neck and neck. I think in terms of where they sit, 1 or 2 wins between them. Probably going to come down to those interdivisional games. They're going to be so crucial. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that division plays out. But let's move on to the next tier that you've got here. So you've classed this one as great teams, but limited once in the playoffs, and we have our two sort of, I think it's fair to call them rivals now at this point. The New York Giants and the Dallas Cowboys from the National East. Give us your breakdown as to why both are great teams, but probably not necessarily in your contender list.
Yeah, so these two teams are teams if I'm betting money, I'm very high on them making the playoffs. I think both GMs are very good. They rank as just about as high as anyone as far as GM talent. And I have these two teams almost tied. I mean, they're as close as they can get. I think it's a coin flip who will win the division. And I think whoever doesn't win the division will still get a wild card spot. Probably 12 wins, 11 wins, just like last year. So from a regular season standpoint, there's really no big issue with these teams, but I think the GMs will do what they need to win games. But once you get into the playoffs, it's kind of a different game. I think that's when, that's when it's hard to match up with some of the elite teams when you don't quite have the talent. And I think that's kind of where these teams are. Kind of start with the Cowboys. Obviously, Gorilla gets the most out of this team, but don't rank well from a pure roster talent. I think they're 26th in defensive roster talent. Just not a great D line, not a great linebacker unit. They're pretty good at cornerback. At offense, kind of the same thing. I think they got a quarterback. I'm forgetting his name. It's the Broncos'
So
old backup.
Lindley's the
Lindley,
quarterback they brought in.
yeah. So I think Garoppolo, I don't think was the answer last year. I think there was hope that he would be, but he completed 46% of his passes, and I think Lindley will be much better in that category. He may not be perfect or great by any means, but they should see an improvement there. But the real story here, though, I think their talent just isn't quite at the level of some of the top teams, and I'm just kind of thinking that it may get exposed a bit in the playoffs. Giants, kind of the same thing. Elite offense. They lost their quarterback to retirement in Manning, but I think they brought in a very comparable quarterback in Matt Moore, and they added some weapons for him in Reggie Wayne and Jimmy Graham. But this defense, again, I think they were average at best last season, and then from a roster standpoint, I think they're probably a little below average. So they're going to be a scary matchup in the playoffs, don't get me wrong, but I don't know if I love their ability to win 3 or 4 games with this defense. But, all it takes is one trade midseason, to figure something out, and that they could take that jump.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of both teams. I think in terms of GMing, we know both are very talented GMs. They've been in the league since we founded it. Dallas probably, as you said, probably don't quite have the talent the V Gorilla will need to really be one of those contenders. A couple of pieces away. Giants obviously said have got some gaps, but on offense they can put up points on any team. So it always gives both teams a shot, either through GM play or through some of the talent that they might have. But I agree that is kind of a sort of a middle tier between the playoff competitive teams and the contenders. So it's interesting you've pulled that out, and that's why that makes the National East just so exciting. It's just because you've got these two teams that I've said rivalries at the beginning of this, but they do go neck and neck with each other, and it makes it so interesting to see from week to week how they stack up against each other. So we'll certainly see how that plays out through the season. So let's move on to the contenders list that you've got here. Usual suspects, to be perfectly honest with you, at this moment in time. Give us your breakdown of maybe how you see these teams kind of playing out together. I mean, are there any that you really think are above and beyond probably the two you've got here, or is it a case of certain talent, certain GMing that kind of positions you these teams as being the contenders for this season?
Yeah, so all these 4 or 5 teams, I think they all have proven GMs, and their roster, while not perfect, I think they're all plenty good enough to not have any major question marks. So that's kind of why they're in that lack of any big issues with their roster combined with a proven GM. I think that's why they're in the spot at the Super Bowl contender. In all honestly, I probably could have separated the Broncos and Ravens into their own tier, and then Saints, Titans, and Panthers into kind of a secondary tier. But for purposes of it seemed like too much to separate those out. But I do like the Ravens and Broncos a tad more. I think the Panthers, us the Saints and the Titans have maybe a tad bit more questions regarding our rosters. Panthers, their defense, I think they'll be fine. Don't get me wrong, but they're probably maybe not quite at the level they hoped they would hope to be. And then, my offense, I think we'll be fine, of course, but I think we'll have a little bit of a question mark. We're not really elite at any offensive spot. And then kind of the Titans. The Titans really have been the story for a while. They'll probably be top 3 in defense for sure, but the offense, maybe not quite. I thought they might get a big quarterback. I don't know if they missed or what the plan there is. Maybe Vince Young, they're rolling with him again. I'm not 100% sure there, but they also got Matt Schaub, which he may be the starter. Who knows? But I don't know if they quite got the quarterback I thought they might get. So when you look at the Broncos and Ravens, I don't even know. I don't really even think they have a question mark on their roster. So you could probably put them in maybe their own tier.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I find fascinating about the top two tiers that you've got here is that every single one has won a Super Bowl, be it Saints with a different GM to yourself, Zach, but all kind of established teams that have been up the top. I mean, you could probably argue the Lions, the Ravens, the Titans, and to some extent the Broncos are kind of starting to age as teams now, and it'd be really interesting to see how that regression change that we're putting in 22 is going to impact some of those teams. So I think that's going to be a really interesting flavour to follow. Maybe not this season, maybe the off season, next season, as some of the guys retire or decline a little bit more rapidly than what we've seen historically. So maybe that gives an opportunity to the Saints and the Panthers to probably take that upper echelon in terms of tiers, or some of the teams even below have drafted some great talent over the past couple of seasons, and that starts to develop. But I guess what I'd be interested to understand a little bit more in terms of the contenders here, I guess, is there any sort of aspect of these teams that really positions them highly? Is it particularly on the offensive defensive side? Are there any sort of that really stand out to you in terms of they are just so far ahead of the others in this tier, or do you feel them sort of all kind of a similar mixed bag in that if they play each other on any given sim that they might they'll win a game? You kind of said I think the Broncos and the Ravens are a little bit further ahead, but I guess I'm interested to understand how far ahead you maybe see them in terms of the tier, or is it really really close, this pack of teams?
It's interesting. I think it more fairly summarizes really really close. I think any five of these teams, if we played head to head, I think it'd be. I mean, obviously there's the chance of a blowout, but I think more often than not it's a 3 point game. I think me and the Panthers split last year. I think I played the Titans last year and lost by 2 or 3 points on the road. So I don't think I played the Ravens or Broncos, but I think that's kind of where we're at again with this group of teams. I think Ravens and Broncos are, I feel a tad better about them, but you're really splitting hairs with any of these five teams as far as head to head or playoffs or whatnot.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with you. I think any of the contenders, any result you could argue is a fair result because they all have the talent to beat each other, and it's just a case of who really turns up on the day and kind of puts in that performance, or maybe gets the right type of game plan just to balance themselves in that age. And even with that factored in, as you said, it's 2-3 points gap usually between some of these guys. So it makes it fascinating because when I look at the league overall in terms of the tiers you've provided here, which is fantastic, that middle pack of teams fighting, maybe developing, getting into the playoffs, maybe just missing out is just so competitive now. It makes it a fascinating watch in terms of how that plays out. But then you've got, when you get into sort of the playoffs and some of the usual teams that are there, the results can go either way, and it's really, really hard to call, I guess. So I think it's fantastic, the tiering list you provided and the rankings, and anyone who hasn't sort of gone down and had a read of their team or looked at the others, please go and have a look, because the time, effort and analysis that Zach puts in is just fantastic. I guess, Zach, before we sign off, is there anything else you wanted to sort of call out in terms of your rankings or in terms of any particular teams that just you're interested to watch this season? Any sort of final thoughts from you?
No final thoughts for me. We didn't really talk about the Lions, so if you want to kind of give an overview of kind of where you see your team, and congrats on winning the title last year. But yeah, if you want to, obviously, I've kind of said it in my rankings. I think, you lost some key talent, but I think your roster was in such a good position, even with a few losses here and there with Mendenhall and the guard, I forget his name, and then Trufant. I still think your roster there's enough of a gap between first and second. I think you kind of deserve your own tier with the title, but I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on your team.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, I'd be interested to see how the impact of losing Mendenhall in terms of the running back position is going to be. We've obviously got Jackson, who is a decent enough running back, but he's no Mendenhall in that we can't run some of the same schemes that we did with Mendenhall last season. And that was a factor in the regular season that we when we did have him before he got injured, and see how that plays out. I think we also have taken a slight drop off in terms of the back position. We made a calculated sort of move in the off season to kind of cash out on Allen. I think he went to, I believe it was Tampa in the end. I could be wrong. I can't remember exactly where we traded him, but we basically knew we weren't going to be able to pay him, so took cash out on him. So yeah, it'd be interesting. I think those minor moves, I think, will probably make us have some gaps if we get one or two injuries, and we'll see how that plays out. Yeah, I think happy with a couple of signings we made in the offseason, a couple of free agents and draftees that we brought in. A little bit more depth probably than we've had for a little while in some key positions that I consider. But yeah, I think like I wouldn't say we're on our own sort of separate tiers. You got here. It's probably just a little bit of Super Bowl hangover. You've placed us here, but I think hopefully we'll be up there and contending this year. But who knows with 22 is how that exactly is going to play out yet. We don't know.
Yeah, it should be fun. And then as far as you may kind of pointed out along the way, but I'm kind of curious if you want to pick out 2 or 3 teams you think I'm most wrong on, either too high or too low. Curious, kind of see where you disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I'll throw one out because I know Justin, the Falcons GM, will certainly find it quite amusing that I'm calling him out as a team that's probably not down the bottom tier after I thoroughly pointed him out as being the bottom tier last season. So I'll throw him one and say, yeah, probably I'd say they're going to be average just because he overperformed with that roster last year, and I think he'll overperform again this year. I think, we talked about the Bengals probably not necessarily being in that tier. I think that they'll probably move up because of the trade they've just made and the GM talent that is there. I think you're a little bit harsh on Kansas City, is what I would say. But I appreciate that some of the talent drop off there, so I probably would agree with you in the long run for that one. And then I guess for me, teams that I'm most excited about seeing really necessarily than sort of challenging on your tiering, I'm really excited to see, in particular, I guess the American North, because you've got the Steelers and the Browns, 2 teams that are making upward trends, and maybe they can have a bit of a neck and neck battle for that sort of second spot and maybe a wild card slot there. That's going to be fascinating. But yeah, I think it's awesome what you've pulled together here, and I haven't got many sort of question marks in terms of what you've laid out here. Really, it's great to see the analysis, and as I said to everyone, please go and have a read of them on the article talk section. And yeah, fantastic work, Zach, and best of luck with the rest of the remaining bit of the off season and then the regular season.
Yeah, good luck to you, and should be interesting to see what happens. I think early in the season there's going to be so many changes with the new engine that teams are going to be. It's going to be interesting to see how teams come out of the gate.
Absolutely, and we'll be back probably at some point in the early regular season to kind of break down some of this madness, because I imagine there's going to be some crazy results that we'll have to look into. But we'll wait and see and how the new engine impacts the league. But fantastic work with the tiers, Zach, and yeah, we'll see what happens.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.